last talk today, and please join me in welcoming Robert Stern from the University of Sheffield. He's also a fellow of the British Academy since 2019. Worked on 19th century philosophy, Hegel of course mainly, but also pragmatism, epistemology in general, modern debates, and who is currently on the Danish philosopher and theologian Rothschild and Martin Luther. And this is part of what we will hear today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for sticking with what has been an interminably long but very interesting day. But if you're as exhausted as I am, you've got pictures at least. That was my thinking. And yeah, Suzanne says this is part of a sort of, as I say, a bigger project, a new project, so full of sort of childish enthusiasm for it. But that means that, I'm probably overdoing things. So the interest is in Luther. And so now I'm seeing Luther everywhere, and as Joe in the back has said to me many times, that to a man with a hammer, everything is a nail. And so the hammer here is Luther, and the nail happens to be Hegel. So again, I may be overdoing it, and you can tell me if I am at the end. Okay. Stupidly. Sorry. Handout. It's just 2 pages, they are collated. Sorry about that. Okay, and my title is a quote which I'll be coming back to. Yeah, you should just be able to let people pass them around. There's 2 pages together. Good. So, Hegel, at several occasions, professes his commitment to Lutheranism. So I'm a Lutheran, and through philosophy have been at once completely confirmed in Lutheranism. This is to a pietistic theologian. We Lutherans, I am, will remain one, have a better faith. I have there explained and expressed Luther's teachings as true and recognised by philosophy as true. I am a professor who prides himself on having been baptised and raised a Lutheran, which he is and shall remain. So compared to most of the German idealists, Hegel's kind of pretty on song when it comes to Luther. But maybe that's pretty superficial. Maybe he's just, keeping his audience happy, and maybe in general, Hegel's religious commitments themselves are pretty superficial. So Taylor says, whatever the sincerity of Hegel's claims to be an Orthodox Lutheran, it is clear that Hegel only accepted a Christianity which has been systematically reinterpreted to be a vehicle of his own philosophy. So he says all this stuff, but take it with a pinch of salt. But as I say, I'm the man with the hammer. I want to say there's more there than you might think. Start with a fun fact. Some of you may know, not all of you may know. Luther wasn't originally called Luther. He was called Luder, which I think can be translated sort of more politely as minx or hussy. It can be translated as worse things. So not a great name to have. I don't know how the family ended up with it, but that's another matter. But around 1517, Luther starts signing himself Eleutherius, meaning the freed one in Greek. And then he went on to shorten this to Luther. So his name, in effect, means the freed one. And so Luther makes this association with freedom in his very own name. But that might seem puzzling, because the one work that you might know about Luther, the text you might know, is De Servo Arbitrio 1525, which is usually translated as on the bondage of the will or on the enslaved will. And in it, Luther is attacking Erasmus's defense of free will in Erasmus's diatribe De Libero Arbitrio of 1524. So it might seem a bit perverse that a man who's calling himself the freed one is writing books saying there is no free will. But if you look at the title of my paper, which I'll come back to, Hegel is happy to connect the Reformation and Luther with freedom. So I want to begin by considering how Hegel himself makes this connection. Yeah, we don't even need that, to be honest. And then I'll suggest ways that we can find a sort of Lutheran provenance for 4 ways in which Hegel himself thinks of freedom. So I'll just label these for now, I'll explain them when we get to them. Freedom as reconciliation, freedom as passivity, freedom as grace, and freedom as necessity. So starting just a little bit of info on Hegel's actual engagement with Luther, it's not as sort of systematic and built into the structure of his thinking as, say, his engagement with Aristotle or Kant. And most of the references to Luther occur in the various lectures on philosophy of religion, philosophy of history, and history of philosophy, usually in the context of general discussions of the Reformation, as you'd expect. Hegel's view of the Reformation, very briefly, is that this occurs in the first part of the section on modern time, and it's the third phase of that section, the German or Germanic world, where Hegel says, we enter upon the period of spirit conscious that it is free, inasmuch as it wills the true, the eternal, and that which is in and for itself universal. That's his sort of characterization of this period. So obviously freedom is highlighted here as crucial. So what does Hegel say about the Reformation? I mean, as you sort of might expect, he's sort of a good Lutheran boy. He locates the roots of the Reformation, the corruption of the Catholic Church, but argues that isn't just accidental, but somehow kind of more constitutive than that, more fundamental. The divine is because the divine is viewed in a purely sensuous form, and the result is a kind of superstitious faith that you find in medieval Catholicism, which then leads to a loss of freedom in various ways. So you have a slavish deference to authority, you have a subordination of spirit to the sensuous, you have a childish belief in miracles, and you have worldly corruption and a lust for power. So Hegel thinks this is a sort of inevitable result of the Catholic way of doing things, and the only way to then overcome these various vices is purely negative. And so virtue, by contrast to the world, becomes otherworldly. So as he says, in actual life, nothing is left for it but avoidance, renunciation, inactivity, and because of this negative relation between virtue and vice, vice can only be transmuted into virtue through a purely mechanical and external process, which leads to indulgences. And of course, as you know, it's indulgences that lead Luther to famously, well, actually wrongly, historians say, but anyway, in the myth, hammer up these 95 theses on the Wittenberg door. Hegel presents the Reformation itself as resulting from the time-honoured and cherished inwardness of the German people. So while the rest of the world is busy kind of going out into the merely external world and going to India and America and so on, Germany is just, all that's really important is happening in the mind of a monk, namely Luther, and a turn away from the material and sensuous towards the spiritual and the absolute, and involving a personal relation to the divine, which isn't mediated by these external practices and institutions, such as the church. There are several, again, I'm just giving you sort of roughly what Hegel says, there are several consequences that follow from this turn to inwardness. First, a move away from the doctrine of works, because works without the inner dimension of faith are worthless. Away from attaching significance to real historical religious events, such as miracles. And there's also an impact on the understanding of the Eucharist. So whereas Catholicism treats the host just as an external thing, and it sort of remains as an external thing, and it receives its consecration externally, that leads as well on the opposite extreme later to Calvinism, which makes the host or the Eucharist merely a commemoration, and Luther is the ideal middle way, where the bread is kind of, the host is, it's a doctrine of consubstantiation by which the externality is annulled, so the presence, as he said, presence of God is utterly a spiritual presence. The consecration takes place in the faith of the subject. So it's a very different kind of picture within the Lutheran story of the Eucharist. And finally, the Reformation does away with the radical split between the church and the laity. The subjective awareness of the truth is the common property of all mankind, Hegel says. And then this then is connected to various points about freedom. So you have freedom from the authority of the church. That doesn't mean there's no church doctrine at all. So Schleiermacher's not right, that it's just all about free feeling. But the individual subject must internalize the truth for themselves. You can't follow the doctrine, as it were, mechanically. And to do so, they must give themselves up to this truth. But in doing so, they don't lose their freedom, but gain it, as they give themselves up to their own truth, which, while it may negate their particularity, means that they are nonetheless at home with themselves, all rather Hegelian things to be saying. And Hegel calls this the freedom of the church. So this is all the effects of the Reformation in terms of freedom. So here's a passage on the handout. Subjectivity therefore makes the objective purport of Christianity, i.e. the doctrine of the church, its own. In the Lutheran Church, the subjectivity and the conviction of the individual is regarded as equally necessary with the objective side of truth. Truth with Lutherans is not a finished and completed thing. The subject must be imbued with truth, surrendering his particular being in exchange for the substantial truth and making that truth his own. In another lecture series related to this, subjective spirit comes to itself through this self-negation because it is absolutely at home with itself. Thus, subjective spirit gains freedom in the truth, negates its particularity, and comes to itself in its truth. In this way, Christian freedom is actualized. If subjectivity is placed in feeling only, without that objective side, we have the standpoint of the merely natural will. And I think that's the digger Schleiermacher, as I understand it. This conception of freedom in its sort of religious context then spills out for Hegel, in his account of the Reformation, into political life, so social structures and manifestations of the universality of thought, in which the will of the subject is embodied and hence free. So the banner of free spirit that is in itself, both finding itself in the truth and only in it being in itself. And it's this point that Hegel makes the remark that I use as a title for this talk. This is the very essence of the Reformation. Man is in his very nature destined to be free. I mean, slightly, not quite the right translation, but close. It's a tricky thing to translate. Then Hegel just considers the historical development of the Reformation itself, from Luther's initial challenge through to the spread of the Reformation becoming a sort of political force. He has some rather amusing, silly things to say about why Italians didn't take to the Reformation and so on. And then he considers, again, how this conception of freedom of religion has an influence on secular life, so the emphasis on marriage as opposed to monasticism, value placed in work in the world, and rejection of blind obedience to authorities against your conscience. So these are all sort of broader social effects of this Lutheran conception of freedom. And he offers a couple of veiled criticisms, I think, of Luther. One is that Luther separates church and state too sharply. The laws of freedom has first to be expanded to a system as deduced from what is right in and for itself. No prize for guessing who's going to do that for you. It's only if you do that you'll get a proper reconciliation of church and state. And again, a further criticism, I think, is that because Luther has left the reconciliation between God and man in grace as a matter for the individual to determine based on some sort of feeling of being saved, that makes it too fragile and vulnerable and uncertain, so in a way it's then more likely people are going to go back to Catholicism, where they know if they do a certain number of things, they'll be fine. So those are sort of concerns Hegel has about Luther, and that allows him in a way to present himself as the second Luther. So there is a kind of reconciliation the Reformation sought, but in the end it's going to need Hegelian philosophy to complete it. And you see this in the address from 1830 on the tercentenary of the submission of the Augsburg Confession. So Hegel says Luther was the trumpet which now proclaimed the wondrous sound of Christian freedom, and that the things which our Luther set in motion were truly new. But, he says, if religion is reformed, the political, legal and ethical system should also be reformed. And that then seems to connect Luther's project to Hegel's as a kind of second Reformation. And you get that also, I think, in the philosophy of right. What Luther inaugurated as faith in feeling and in the testimony of the Spirit is the same thing that the Spirit, as a more mature stage should be a more mature stage of its development, endeavours to grasp in the concept, so as to free itself in the present and find itself therein. So you have to sort of transmute Luther's original projects into more Hegelian terms to complete it. Okay, so that was a sort of quick sketch of, one of the main discussions of Luther in Hegel's lectures, to give you a flavour of what Hegel's doing with Luther and how in particular he's connecting Luther with freedom. And so now I want to look at that in a bit more detail. And I'm going to start by talking about the idea of freedom as reconciliation. And what I mean by that, as you'll know from the Hegelian perspective, the reconciliation involves subjects seeing themselves in the other, hence as reconciled to the other in a way that means that they're no longer alien, and therefore something with which the subject can be at home and hence related in this kind of freedom. So you can see this in, for example, the conclusion of Hegel's discussion of the Reformation. What forms the basis of the Reformation is the abstract moment of a mind being within itself, of freedom, of coming to self. Freedom signifies the life of the spirit being turned back within itself in the particular content which appears as another. While spirit is not free if it allows this other being, either assimilated or dead, to exist in it as something foreign. You need to bring the other within the self, or within the subject, in order to achieve this kind of reconciliation with it. Now, there's clearly a lot of Hegel in that passage, but in what way is it, or could one relate that to Luther? Well, we've already seen in various ways that on Hegel's account, Luther rejected various forms of externality in relation to the believer's relation to God. So we saw that briefly in relation to the Eucharist, we saw that in relation, say, to the authority of the Church. The problem with the authority of the Church is that it seems to leave it alien from the believer, and therefore you cannot be fully reconciled. You need to bring it within your own sense of faith. So there are those sorts of conceptions of reconciliation, freedom as reconciliation going on, but is there anything deeper, as it were? Well, I think you can see something deeper if you go back to Luther's name change and ask what prompted him to call himself the freed one in the first place. And the name change occurs around the time